Okay, I don't normally start from up here, but in case somebody's in the parking lot, they can hear me from here. We're glad to have with us today Alex Lisk. I'll never forget the first time I got a letter from Alex Lisk. I didn't even know who that was. Because we know him as Shelley from camp. And we're glad that he can be with us today and share with us about the work that's going on in Australia and what his plans are. And so I'm going to turn it over to you. You got about 45 minutes.
All right, sounds good. All right, yeah, thank you guys so much for allowing me to come here today. It's a real joy and privilege to be here, and humbling as well. So a little bit about me. So I'm from Chatham, Virginia, so just down the road here. But I'm a missionary now in Australia, which is a really kind of different place. When we think about missions, a lot of times I'll tell people, yeah, missionary Australia. They're like, oh, that's interesting, because it's not really a place that we think of a lot of times as being a place for missions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, I'm going to apologize for my voice as I'm talking. I got over a flu a couple weeks ago, and I'm over it now, but still got a little problem with like the little leftover from it. So if my voice randomly cracks or something, I apologize. But real quick, before I really get started, and I do this everywhere I go, think about what it was like when you became a Christian. So when that time, whenever it was, when you said, hey, I want to follow Jesus, what was it like? What were some of the moments, some of the people that really led you to that decision? So you can go to the next slide. So I'm sorry, I forgot this part. I'm with New International, and we're partnered with Australia Christian Mission. There's a weird interruption there. Go ahead, next slide. So, the city that we're in Australia is called Newcastle. So it's the 7th largest city in Australia. Second largest from the state of New South Wales, where I am. And if you can see on the map, it's kind of right there, about 2 hours north of Sydney. For those who are listening on the radio right now, it's kind of in that southeastern part of the country. It's kind of hard to describe without the map there, but about the southeastern part. So there's a population within Newcastle, about 350,000, give or take. And it's the largest coal exporting port in the world, which is a little fun fact. If you go out there, I have some pieces of coal that are out there, some really smooth rock. But it's interesting because I picked it up on the beach where I found all those shells, and the sand they actually take and will import to Waikiki Beach in Hawaii. I found out. So you have it's interesting. We have like this pristine sand, and you have like coal coming out of the rock side right on the same beach. So you go to the next slide. So here's a few pictures of where I'm at. So like I said, we're right on the coast. It's a surfing city. So a lot of waves, a lot of beach, really good time. And very, very pretty. I was blown away by how beautiful Australia was the first time I came there, and you can really see what God is really, the beauty of His creation out there. I was like, wow, this is such a beautiful place. But despite that, the beauty of it, it's still within this broken world. There's still this darkness that's there, this longing for something. So you can go to the next slide. So like I said earlier, when I tell people, hey, I'm a missionary in Australia, a lot of people are like, well, that's interesting, because we have bands like Hillsong that are coming out of there. For King and Country are really popular. So surely this must be this strong Christian nation. And the reality is, well, not so much. See, Australia was founded as a penal colony, and so very different from when we were founded, where a lot of people came here for religious freedom. That was never really part of the Australian identity. The church was there, but it was kind of more of like an institution kind of idea. And there was never this great awakening moments like that we had in the U.S. The closest that they ever really got to thinking of faith was when Billy Graham just being who he was, Billy Graham, a lot of people start thinking, hey, maybe there is something more to this, but never really went too much farther than that. So some of the data I have here is a little dated. So in 2016, census was taken, and non-religion was the fastest growing religion in Australia. They recently had another census here in 2021, and that's still continuing to be the case. Prior to that census, Christianity was about 55% of the population. Now, about 45% say they're Christian. So it's now less than half. It's the most secular nation in the world, or one of the most secular nations in the world among English-speaking countries. And even though about 45% say, hey, we're Christian, it's kind of more just, this is what we do, or this is just kind of our heritage kind of deal. In terms of like how many people actually go to church regularly, it's actually about maybe 5%. And by 5%, I mean every 2 weeks rather than every week. Or by regularly, I mean every 2 weeks, sorry. So a lot of people who are in Australia, it's not so much that they are against Christianity. They're like, I don't want to be part of this, but just kind of the very relaxed kind of culture and that they kind of give off. They kind of give off like a hippie vibe is how a lot of people describe it to me. Very relaxed, very like, go with the flow. And that's kind of how they approach faith as well. You know, it's more of like, well, hey, if that works for you, great. I'm just going to kind of do my own thing. And there's just not really much more thought about it other than that. But despite that, there's still a lot of hurting that happens in Australia. Australia is one of the top 25 drunkest countries in the world. Gambling and prostitution is legal in Australia. And this one breaks my heart because I had to do a lot of stuff with youth. It's one of the leading statistic holders in teen suicides in the world. It's number 2, just behind New Zealand. Because despite it being a pretty country and beautiful, there's this longing that's there, right? You know, the world is challenging. We live in a broken world. And a lot of Australians are trying to cope with that in ways that only God can really provide. And that's what we want to do, is provide and say, hey, here's who Jesus is. So a little bit about my life real quick. So I asked you guys earlier, what was it like when you guys became a Christian? And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the sermon later. When I became a Christian, I became a Christian when I was 15. I didn't always grow up as a Christian. And the reason I became a Christian was because I started going to church and started just seeing people who actually believed and lived out what they claimed to believe. And for me, that just clicked on something. I think there's something more to this. And prior to that, I was just very lonely and just not really sure what, if anything, life was about. And I was kind of wandering and going through the motions of life. And then I found Jesus, and I found purpose, meaning, joy. Right? When I got to Australia, what I noticed was there's a lot of people who are just searching for something, but they don't know what that something is. And similar to me, a lot of them are lonely. Just kind of going through the motions, not really sure what, if anything, life is about. So, when I was in high school, I felt the call to become a missionary, go into ministry. And I felt what God was saying to me was, okay, Shelly, in the same way that people invested in you, that people live their lives around you, it's now your turn to do the same. And that's a lot of what our ministry does. We want to build authentic relationships with people, to show them here's the love of Christ, here's the gospel of Christ and his meaning for your life. If you can go to the next slide. So everything that we do revolves around being a relational ministry and making disciples, mentoring. I'll talk about that more in a second, but there's several things that we do underneath that umbrella. We're also a church planting ministry, so we want to plant more churches as we go along. We also get to volunteer in the public schools, which is a really interesting ministry in itself. And we do other things to be involved within the community. But everything that we do revolves around let's build a relationship with people. So what does that look like? You can go to the next slide. Okay, I think I sent you the wrong slide on accident. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, keep going. I apologize for this. Okay, that's fine. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, I'm sorry. So I did a presentation on my trip a while back, and My bad. So the one church plant that we have right now is in Newcastle, so it's called North Lakes Christian Church. The congregation is about 75 to 100 people, give or take, and that's about the average size of a church in Australia. I found out that we're actually, even though we're in the city of 350,000 people, we have a youth group of about 12, and we're one of the largest youth groups in the area. So it is a bit smaller than what a lot of churches are in the U.S., but yeah, so we do a few things within the church. Sunday morning, Sunday morning, the preaching, and several things that we do similar here in Stateside. And we meet in a community center, but one thing that we do, and again, this goes along the lines of building relational ministry, is we have coffee time before church and coffee and tea time after church. And the idea with that isn't, hey, let's have this really nice cup of coffee, you know, we get the couches around together, and all that's great, but it's not about having this fantastic cup, because a lot of times I was the one making the coffee, so it was kind of good luck. But the idea was, hey, let's come together, let's have a conversation with one another. Let's build that community together. So that way, if someone's coming in and they don't know Jesus yet, we can invest in them, we can love them. And if we go throughout the week, you know, there's not a lot of Christians in Australia, I found out, and they can feel lonely even as a Christian. We can encourage one another and build that relationship and encourage one another. And so that's me making coffee there. I'm trying to think about, sorry.
What's on the left there?
The left there? So that,
On the left.
yeah, so that is, so that's our community center that we're in. So that is Sunday morning worship. In the back of that particular Sunday, I think we're doing a family Sunday that day. And we had some of the kids kind of coming in and coloring and stuff like that. So that's kind of what church looks like. From what I understand now, I haven't been there in a bit because of COVID. They've changed it a little bit to where they actually meet in tables and we have small group discussions after the sermon. So that way we can kind of talk about what was talked about and do the discipleship in that way. So we also do youth group on Wednesday nights, and that's something I get to be part of as well. We also have a young adult ministry, and that's one of my favorite ministries that we get to do. It's sweet. So on the picture on the left here, you can see where we're all around a table, we're playing cards, playing a board game. And I'm awkwardly smiling towards the camera. But what we're doing there is it's more about board games and stuff like that. So this isn't a Bible study, but it's a place where Bible studies can happen. So we call this night Monday Fun Day. So what it is every Monday we come together, we play board games. We have Christians and non-Christians coming to this. And again, the idea is just let's just love on people as much as we can. And through that, we've had some people who have never talked about Jesus before, never thought about Jesus before, started hanging out with us loving on them, building that relationship, and said, hey, I see how you guys live, and there's just something more to it. I'm interested in this. We got to go through the Bible with them later on. And some people said, hey, after going through this, after seeing how you guys live, after reading the Bible, I want to follow Jesus. And it all began with a simple act of playing board games. So it's one of the cool things that we get to do. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so that's our youth group night, and that's me teaching there. We're one of the few churches in Australia, I think that is 2, and we're one of them. We actually had 9 square in the air, and the kids love that. And that's me teaching there. So if you go to the next slide. Yeah. So we also are in the public schools, and this is a really interesting ministry. So how we got to be in the public schools and serve there, Rob, our pastor at the church, he's a chaplain in the public schools. So Australians, they're very pragmatic, right? So they recognize that even though they're not very spiritual themselves, and they're not, very religious per se, they recognize that there's a need for a spiritual person to be kind of in the schools. And a chaplain will be that person. They act kind of like a guidance counselor, is the best way I can the equivalent in the US. But they do that to the students, but also they serve the faculty and the staff that are there. So we got to serve in that way, and we're in a school that's in a rougher area. So where a lot of kids are, if I scream the loudest, they'll get what I want. So we got to work through some issues with that, with kids, like, hey, here's how we can cope, and just do a lot of awesome ministry there. And then we also got to help out in some of the classrooms, and again, just being that salt and that light there. So on the right, this is the most interesting thing I think we do, because it's so different than anything we do in the U.S. So that's in a public school, and I'm teaching the Bible to kids in the public school. So it's called scripture teaching, and kids can opt in. Used to, you had to opt out, but now it's you opt in. And a lot of these kids, this is the first and maybe only time in their lives they really get to hear the Bible. And I can say, hey, here's what God's word actually says. And I get to share that with them. And then, like, you know, I've taught kids here in the U.S., but kids there where this is their first time hearing it, they'll be like raising their hands, asking questions. This is really, really exciting to see. And I tell people, I don't know what God is going to do with those seeds, but I know He's going to do something, which is just really, really exciting and an interesting ministry to be part of for sure. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this, one of the ministries that we also get to do, every October we have what's called Quest Camp. So camp was a huge part of my life growing up. Once I became a Christian in high school, Camp Pitt. And I was super excited, like, all right, we're going to do camp here. So this is a high school, young adult ministry that we got to do. And the picture on the right is my little small group that we had. And the picture on the left is the entire group that we had. So this particular camp is mostly just from our church, but we also have another church that we partner with, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But there's just a really, really fun time. And this also kind of shows like the really coolness of our ministry as well. So one of the people in my group, Nat, she's on the far left of that picture. And she's not a Christian, and you know, she came from a family who were Christians, but she herself wasn't quite there yet. She started coming to our small adult group, just hanging out with us, and said, hey, I want to go to camp. I'm like, awesome, sweet. And I'm talking one night, we're leading a small group discussion after the sermon, and everybody's just like really, really quiet, and no one's really wanting to answer. I'm like, okay, well then, and I forget the question that I asked, but to my surprise, Nat answered. And again, I forget the question, but I remember the answer because that's the important part. She said, you know, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm really interested in the way that Christians live their lives. It's very different than from what I've seen. And again, I'm not there yet, but this is really, really interesting to me. And I know that's not a conversion, it's not a baptism, it's not a decision to follow Christ, but what I see there is, hey, here's the Holy Spirit working. See, Australia is a very slow ministry because, again, a lot of people just are kind of indifferent towards Christianity, towards following Jesus, and just don't really care. So a lot of our ministry is building that. It's like, hey, let's have that relationship so we can talk about that, so we can get to a place where, hey, they do care. And that's what's happening there. And it's just a really, really cool aspect of our ministry. If you can go to the next slide. All right. So, let's kind of wrap up here. A couple other things that we get to do. So going back to the public schools, we get to do what we call Brekkie Club. So instead of Breakfast Club, Aussies like to say Brekkie. So the school that we're in, a lot of kids will show up, they haven't had breakfast yet, so we get to serve them and make toast. So they can get up to 3 pieces of toast, and they can get 3 things on their toast. They can get butter, they get jam, and because it is Australia, they can get Vegemite as well. And yeah, you have a question? Vegemite? So Vegemite is, I have some here actually if anyone wants to try it, but fair warning, it's salty. But it's like yeast extract, so looks like Nutella. Doesn't taste like Nutella. Very salty. Aussies like to put a little bit on their toast, put some butter on it to kill kind of saltiness, and just add just a little kind of like dab. So the rule is more is less. So if you just do a little bit, it kind of gives that nice kind of salty flavor, but sometimes Aussies will, when Americans come over, they're like, here, try a spoonful of this. If you're ever in Australia, please don't do that. But anyway, so we got to give them toast. And I remember this one day, this kid comes up, and so the rule is we give them 2 pieces of toast, and they can eat that, and if they want another piece of toast, they can come back. So this kid comes up, he's going for his 3rd piece of toast, and this kid is about a year or 2, so a little tiny, so they're 2nd grade. And his friend's like, man, why are you getting your 3rd piece of toast? Like, that's a lot. And he says, well, I haven't eaten since I was here yesterday. And that just blew my mind, because this is not a 3rd world country. This isn't a place like that. But even here, where there's a land of plenty, people are still hurting. Things like that still happen. And there we get to be the salt and the light to help meet those needs. So that's a little bit about what we do. So moving forward for me, I think if you skip to the last slide, it should be there. So a little about what I'm doing forward. So I graduated from Johnson University in 2019. So I went to Australia first time 2018, came back in 2019 for 6 months. And afterward I felt like, yeah, this is where God wants me to be, so I affiliated full time. And so my plan is to head back there. So when I head back, I'll be working for a few months. Yeah, there it is. For a few months in North Lakes, so probably about 3 to 6. North Lake is continuing to adapt to the culture, learn a little bit of ministry as well. But I mentioned earlier that we've been partnering with another church and the way things are going now. So what we want to do, this church has been struggling for a few years now, and we want to do a re-church plant, essentially. So just bring life back in there. And that church plant is in Sydney. So when I head back, the conversations I've been having is I'll get to be part of that new church planting team, working a lot with the youth, working a lot with the young adults as well, and also get to do some preaching as well, which is exciting. So I'll be a little bit of about what I do when I head back. I'm really excited for that. So I think that's pretty much everything I have. Do you guys have any questions for me about what I've talked about, or about Australia, or just anything?
You're right. When you think of mission work in Australia, you think, well, they're so much like the U.S.
Right. Yeah, so for the people who are listening to the radio, what you said was, yeah, when you think about it, Australia just really isn't a place to think about because it must be so much like the U.S. And yeah, it definitely blew my mind when I got there, because like when I arrived in Australia, you could just you could feel it. Like things looked like America, but like there was just like this spiritual dryness is the best way I can describe it. And I've talked to a couple of other missionaries who've been there, and that's how they describe it as well, where it's like, it's almost like, Australia has that reputation of being this very dry country, climate-wise. It's a desert. And that's kind of how it feels spiritually there. Which is a weird thing to describe, but like it's just how it feels, and there's just a need for water. And that's kind of what we get to do, is try to bring some water, bring life back in there. So yeah.
Were they ever, was Christianity ever there, or and then lose it?
Yeah, so
trying to get it back.
Yeah, so for people on the radio, she asked, so was Christianity ever there, or did it leave and they're trying to get it back? So yes and no. So when Australia was colonized, a lot of it was just like, here are our petty prisoners, we're just setting them down there. So, here in the U.S., the idea was, okay, we're going to send, pilgrims. A lot of people are going to come for religious freedom. People didn't go to Australia for religious freedom. So there never really was people said, hey, we're Christian. And, the church was there, it was present. But a lot of what the church did during the colonial times was kind of, okay, we're going to provide basic needs for society. So like school, like healthcare, stuff like that. But it wasn't really necessarily for spiritual reasons, if that makes sense. So how it's been described to me is like, Well, it was there, yeah, but in terms of like a spiritual, like, hey, we're following Jesus, not so much. It was very surface level. So I think back in the 40s, it was like 70% of the population said we're Christian, but church attendance has never been high. Australia has never, if you ask Australians, they would say like we're not really a Christian nation. It's part of our past, part of our history, but by the time that colonization started, so they started colonizing, what was it? I think it was like 1788, so like after the Revolutionary War, so it's very late in history, and some of them weren't even settled until about the 1850s. And by that point, even in England, it was starting to, the Great Awakenings here, and I think there were some revivals going on in England, but even then, like it was kind of starting to be on the decline. So by the time they got to Australia, it was just like there wasn't much seed there to begin with. So, which also makes it challenging for us because, all right, so there's not a lot of seed here, but the harvest is still plentiful, and the labor few. So that's part of what we are doing as well, is that, people in Australia, there is that longing for something. I said that Australia is a very secular nation, and it's not atheist. So like atheists, like it's still a very small part of the population. Most Australians believe in something, but they're just kind of like, we'll figure it out kind of deal, or just I'll do my own thing. My truth is my truth kind of idea. So they are searching for something. But there's never been this moment where we believe it's Jesus. There's been few for sure, but in general, most of them are just kind of like, we're here, we're gonna make the best of it. We're gonna maybe try to figure some faith things out, but the church has never had that strong presence and still doesn't. So.
Does the Catholic Church have a large presence there?
Yeah. So for people on radio, she asked if the Catholic Church has a large presence there. So yes. So the Catholic Church, I want to say, is the largest denomination there. So, and that came from, so a lot of the prisoners came from Ireland, where there's a lot of Irish Catholic. Right after Catholic is the Anglican Church. So from England, and then there's Presbyterian Church from Scotland, a few other churches there. The actual people who were claiming, hey, we're evangelical, so with our kind of grouping, that would be, I think 2%, and that's largely the Baptist Church. But again, that's only 2% of the population. The Christian Church, Church of Christ, that we're part of, there's a couple churches scattered throughout Australia of that, but it's not a recognized denomination by the government, so very small. But the Catholic Church is by far the largest. Second to that would be the Anglican Church, which bears a lot of similarities to the Catholic Church. So. Yeah.
With the way y'all set up church, like that picture that we saw where all the adults were one end of the room, being taught, and the kids are in the back, is that just a byproduct of the building that y'all had to work with, or was it by design and paying everybody in the same space?
Yeah. So what he asked was, okay, so the picture I showed, there were kids in the back while the worship service was going on, and he was asking what I said is a byproduct of how the building is, and yes and no. So that particular Sunday was a little bit different where we took that picture. So normally the kids, so in the community center that we meet in, we rent, 3 rooms, and we also have a hallway space. So we have the main worship session, that room that you saw. Normally the kids are in a different room, that's just right next door. And then we also have the daycare kind of room that we use. So that particular Sunday was just a little bit different than what we normally do, and I can't remember why it was. However, we are because we don't have a building ourselves, and when I go down to Sydney to help out with the church, they also don't have a building themselves because real estate's just crazy in Australia. So we are kind of dependent upon, okay, what is the spaces that we're able to get? Now, a lot of community centers, libraries, schools are like, hey, you can rent out your space on Sunday, and that's awesome. So we are kind of dependent upon that, so, yeah.
So there are no freestanding churches of Christ or Christian churches?
So she asked if there are no freestanding Christian churches, Church of Christ. So there are, Some churches do, but they're older, or they're either older or they have a lot of money. The real estate in Australia, this kind of gives and this is more modern and recent. So like when I go back to Australia, I'm going to be paying $500 a month, $500 a week for a 750 square foot house or apartment, and that's the average. So if you want to buy your own house, it would be about $1 million. If you want to buy a house, it'd be $750,000. If you want to build your own house, it'd be about $1 million and have a half acre of land. So not a whole lot. So real estate is just really, really, really high. So a lot of churches that are there, because there are physical buildings that do have churches. They either, again, they have a lot of money where they can afford to build and add on, or they're old and those have been there since, they've settled the city, or before the housing crisis really got going. So they're there. It's just, for what we're trying to do doing church planting, funds is kind of a big thing. So it's kind of like, okay, do we have enough money to build a church? I think they're actually talking about maybe looking for a permanent home, but even then it's like 5-10 years down the road. So it's just not something that we'd like to do one day, but it's not something that, one, is a priority for us right now, and two, we're getting closer to being able to do that, but just not quite there yet. So, yeah, question?
With music, so I know here we have, the Journey's sort of a regional radio station. You have K-Love that's a little more national. How's the Christian music scene in Australia?
Yeah, so he asked, how's the Christian music scene in Australia? So here we have K-Love and other regional stations. So I do know I think there's one station that I remember that some people would listen to. It's not popular, but I think that was the only one in Newcastle. And I think it was based out of Sydney, so that probably was for all of New South Wales. So Hillsong is from there. They have their own label. They're a mega church. But most people, it's interesting, I found this out, they're actually more popular in America than in Australia. So most people have either never heard of Hillsong, just because it's not Christian music is not popular there. So if I've never heard of it, or if they have heard of it, they tend not to be huge fans of it, because they're kind of like, okay, you're a church, but you're making all this money off of music and you're getting the tax write-offs for it. And that's nothing, and I'm not being against Hillsong here. I love their music and stuff, and we sing some of their music in our church. But again, the Christian music scene is just not really big. So even for King and Country, for example, so they're from Australia, kind of. So they were born there, moved here when they were like 6, I think. But their label is based in Nashville. So the only Christian music that's actually coming from Australia is Hillsong, and even bands that are from Australia or New Zealand as well, a lot of times they'll come stateside. That's when their label is from. And occasionally they'll play shows, like for King and Country played, had a tour recently for the first time before the pandemic. But again, it's just kind of, it's not really big. So it's there, but very, very small. So, good question. Yeah. So, any more questions, or if not, thank you so much for allowing me to come here today. If you want to hear more about what I do, I'll be here all day. I'm excited for the chili cook-off, and yeah. All right, thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.
So we got a few minutes. Let's review some of our mission points that we do support on a regular basis. And start on the end. Sunlight Christian Mission. Who knows where Sunlight Christian Mission is? Haiti. And who's the missionary? Emilio. All right. And So, before COVID, Amelia was here a number of times. And since COVID, we haven't had anybody out of the States here that much. So, but we need to continue to remember them and the work they're doing. They're doing a medical work and Christian school in Haiti, trying to help better the lives of the people in Haiti, as well as teach them about Jesus and overcome the power of voodoo. All right, the Mountain Mission School. Where's Mountain Mission School located? Grundy. Okay. How many people have been to the Mountain Mission School? All right, we got a few that have been to the Mountain Mission School. I'll never forget my first trip to the Mountain Mission School was during one of the prayer clinics. One of the first prayer clinics I ever went to. And turning through Mountain Mission School and in Tyler Hall, there was a little blonde-headed, blue-eyed boy that was about the same age Brian was at that particular time. So this is back in the 80s, early 80s. And that little boy looked up at me and said, "Mister, would you please take me home?" And, you just tore my heart out, thinking about that. But they do serve a lot of children. And not just from the mountains. It started serving children in the mountains. But it's not just in the mountains anymore. They bring kids from all over the world to Mountain Mission School. Pioneer Bible Translators. Who do we support with Pioneer Bible Translators?
Rachel Kraft.
All right, Rachel Kraft. And Rachel is supposed to be headed to Thailand real soon. The Bible translation in Myanmar is really making good strides, and they're publishing different books of the New Testament now. So that's a good thing, and just continue to pray for that. Camp Pitt. And we think about Camp Pitt, of course the kids love Camp Pitt. But Camp Pitt is more than just camp. And sometimes people forget that. But I'm thinking about people that have been to camp. There's Shelley, working in Australia. There's John Kraft, that was highly involved with the Bible translation and has now chosen a different path, but he's still involved with what's going on there. There's Frank Reynolds, that started Rwanda Challenge, teaching the church leaders in Rwanda the Bible, because they didn't have a Bible college. In fact, now they've actually established a Bible college with the help of Mid-Atlantic Christian University in Rwanda. So,
Go back to here, you got Sandy Shannon.
right, you got finished. But yeah, Sandy Shannenberger, the way we all remember, was Sandy Killian, married to Tom Killian. They're doing work in South Sudan with Mercy Partners. And Sandy went through camp. So, and I could go on with a list of others, but I won't because our time's going to run out. But so camp has had an impact not just on kids here, but through the kids here, having an impact on the world. That's important to remember as we support that. Central India Christian Mission, Ajay and Indu Law, great people. And something I never thought about until I was in India with them was the fact that they're not just working in India. There are 12 countries that they're involved in. And in those 12 countries, half of the world's population lives. So that's a tremendous mission to go after half of the world's population and what they're doing. Climbing Higher Ministries, everybody knows about Climbing Higher, right? At least here we do. But we work hard on reaching the special needs adults and their mentors and families. It's not just to the special needs adults, but there are a lot of families that are hurting because they have somebody who has a special need, and many times those people are not welcome in a lot of churches, and they don't feel welcome. in a lot of churches. And so there's a great population there that's being ignored that needs to know Jesus. Northeast India Christian Mission, Billy Shockler. And Billy hasn't been able to be here since the last time he was at Camp Pitt. And the reason he hasn't been allowed back is the last time he was at Camp Pitt, he overstayed his visa. And because of that, the government, our government, marked him as a terrorist. And they won't let him back in the country. All right? So I've been thinking, we haven't talked to Billy in a long time. I've been thinking, now with all the technology that we've got available, that maybe one Sunday I'm going to get him LinkedIn, through Skype, or Zoom, or some of that sort of thing, and just let him talk to everybody about what they're doing, because I think that's important that we hear from him. And now he doesn't have to come to the United States. We can just bring him over the internet and let him talk to us. Waypoint Church Partners. Of course, that started out as the BEF, and they merged with Evangelism Group down in Carolina. And now they're actually serving South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland, what their realm is. And of course, they started churches in other parts of the world as well. And then over here, Johnson University and Mid-Atlantic Christian University, the two Bible colleges that we support from here, and have graduates from both places here. And my heart's kind of in Mid-Atlantic because that's where I went. And Mid-Atlantic, I don't know how many of you realize it. I think I may have said it, but Jack Cottrell, who just passed away, great professor, author, donated his entire library to Mid-Atlantic Christian University. So that's interesting. And Mid-Atlantic's going through lots of changes with buildings because of the collapse of Heritage Hall, the new cafeteria, which is called Alligood Commons. Y'all remember Philip and R.J. and Alligood, some of them? Philip held revival for us a few years ago.
Or James from Sheba.
Do what?
Or James
Or
from
James
Sheba.
from Sheba, yeah. But that's a good school. Parker just got accepted there. I go to school there next fall if he decides to play soccer for them. All right, and Johnson University. Johnson may be one of the oldest Bible colleges left in existence, because we've lost a few, and some new ones have started. But Johnson is in Knoxville, Tennessee. Beautiful campus, really beautiful place, and great professors there doing a great work, and of course their Bible colleges training people to preach, but not just training preachers, they training missionaries, other people. Johnson has what is that center called at Johnson that's focused on missions?
See, there's Richardson Hall, and then that's where most of the missions classes
Seems like there's something with gun in the name of it. And they may have changed that since I was down there.
They may. I mean, there's a lot of things that they do.
It used to be the same building that had missions, teaching, and all languages was.
Yeah, that's Richardson.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so they most schools put a lot of emphasis on missions and preaching, and so that's what's
Next
important.
year will be the 130th year.
Yeah.
They've been around since 1893, so.
Okay. Any questions about any of those missions? ITES is not one we do regularly, but it's one we give money to when things happen that, we know we need to send money to.
These are all faith promises.
This is where your faith promise money has been going for the last, I don't know how many years.
Well, it's gathered for the month and then divided by.
Yeah, whatever comes into the faith promise program, and all of that money goes to missions. So whatever comes in this month, faith divided by 10, and out it goes.
So it's 10% of the offering, but also it's anything designated to faith promise, right? So if somebody.
Yeah, all the money that goes straight to faith promise, all the money you put in those white envelopes out there, all of that goes to these places.
And then 10% of the offering.
Yeah, and 10% of the general fund offering will be added to the missions, so that helps too. That helps support these places. And then the special offerings for like ICE. So when your bulletin actually says that we've given like 15,000 some odd dollars so far this year to missions, that's just the money that came in those white envelopes. That doesn't count the Wednesday night offering that goes to Sunlight Christian Mission. It doesn't count the special offerings like for ICE or like we took up for Mount Pleasant a few weeks ago to help with their roof thing. It doesn't count that. So, I mean, you're looking at a church this size, and what blows a lot of people's minds is that probably 20% of the money that comes into this church, that's counting all the funds, about 20% of the money that comes into this church goes out to missions. That's how much we believe in missions and how we want to support missions. And so we look at the little church and say, well, what are we accomplishing? Well, you got to think on a broader scope. And can we do more locally? Yes, we need to do a lot more locally. And Frank and I were talking about that just a little earlier. What we're going to do maybe next year is to try to help build our focus locally, but our worldwide focus is great. Can it be better? Of course, always. But for church, any church, to say 20% of their missions giving is going, 20% of all of their giving is going to missions, most people can't believe that we're doing that. But I think that's why God blesses us, is because we're not stingy with our money. We're making sure people have a chance to hear the Word of God. All right, any other thoughts or comments?
You mentioned, I will say, Parker and I are going down, he's visiting Matthew on the 12th.
Okay. Would you lead us in prayer?
Yes, sir. Father God, thank you for this day, and thank you for the opportunity to come and learn about Alice's work in Australia, to talk about missions and focus on missions, and pray for our missionaries, and pray that you will bless this next hour of worship we have together there. Please take what we give to these missions and use it, multiply it, help us